Hi everyone, welcome to this week's DevOps Chat. I am absolutely honoured to have with me Chris Matz, who has written a book that's completely changed the way I think about how we make decisions and how we develop software. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us first of all.
Thank you very much for having me.
Perhaps, there's so much interesting that I'd like to talk to you about, but perhaps we could begin with you just telling us a little bit about your background, what you've worked on in the past, and also what your interests are currently.
So, started off as a developer, then I did the BA thing and the project management thing and the area, climbed up the greasy pole in the traditional waterfall land before I fell into Agile. Most of my career, I've worked in risk management and trading systems on the trading floor of investment banks. And when I got involved in Agile, I realized that Agile was a better way of managing risk than kind of traditional waterfall kind of software development. And it was that point that I kind of got involved in something called real options, which is a kind of a risk management approach and a decision-making approach for people.
Wow, fantastic. And so what are you working on currently then?
As with most people who are kind of on the Agile journey, it's a matter of kind of like the theory of constraints. So as soon as you solve one problem and you level up to kind of level 27, you discover the next problem at level 28. So I'm currently trying to wrap my head around the culture problem and how do we shift groups to have a culture that is supportive of an Agile way of working and doesn't try and kill it in a waterfall way of working.
Mm-hmm. Which is, and it's fascinating that you raise that, because we've had quite a few DevOps chats now, and it's amazed me how much comes back to culture and attitude, even when we have chats about containerizations or subjects that seem quite technical. A lot of the time, so when you ask about, well, how do you make that change? How do you get people on board? It doesn't come back to a better installer. It comes back to the culture and how you create an organization where that's encouraged.
Yeah, I must admit, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I thought culture was for tree huggers and hippies. Wasn't particularly interested in it. I'm more interested in technical skills and processes and software and stuff. And then I worked in an organization where we kind of got most of the processes right, but the culture eventually killed what we're trying to do. And I was actually really, really lucky, because I immediately went from one company where you'd got this innovative startup working with a traditional culture to another company where there was an innovative lab working within a traditional culture. And it was only because I'd gone from one company to another that I was able to see exactly the same patterns of behavior between the two different cultures. And it was really obvious that in both situations, it was the same difference in culture between the two, between the innovation and the kind of traditional organization. And kind of that's in a way where I got really interested in culture, because once you can see it, you then kind of hunt it with a gun and shoot it in the head.
In a very diplomatic and politically correct way.
Yeah. Big gun.
A few months ago, we were very fortunate. We had Liz Keogh join us for a DevOps chat, talking about behavior-driven development. And one thing I just meant, she introduced me to your book, which I'll show now, Commitment.
Thank you.
It's I raised it with her because she is one of the stars in it. I think it's really cool if you are actually someone that features in a graphic novel. When Liz Key was sort of telling me about it at the Kanban conference, I didn't really get it. But then I read your book, and it was suddenly it changed. It fundamentally changed the way I saw decision making and problems, both in my personal life and in my professional life. So I'd be really interested to hear from you, perhaps a little bit the story behind how you got to writing the book, and what were the drivers for you?
So the book came about as opposed to the real options. I think the book's a much more interesting story than the real options. I think real options, I was just kind of like wandering around in the dark one night looking for the toilet, tripped over a brick and kind of hit my head, and there was real options. So nothing interesting there. The actual book is much more interesting, because when I first, I think it was Agile 2006, I met Olav Marson, and he said, yeah, let's do a book about this. And it went forward for a few years, and we didn't really do anything on it. And then in 2008, I met Amma El-Samadisi, who was the editor of Agile Journal, I think it was. And I had got really, really angry with the government because they'd banned short selling on bank shares. And as a result, I ended up drawing this massive comic book. So Luke Homan introduced me to a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is brilliant. It's the best business book I've read in a decade. So I read this book, and it tells you how to explain ideas in comic book form. And I was so angry. I kind of did this 80-page rant on why the government were idiots for banning short selling of bank shares, because it's a technical thing. I've got a master's degree in financial mathematics, and there's a very technical reason why they were just stupid. And I did that. And then when I finished, I kind of then sat down and thought, oh, that was quite fun drawing the comic by hand. It was just stick men. It was absolutely terrible. So having done the stick men, I then thought, oh, let's write some stories about Agile. So I started doing real option comics, just like 3 or 4 pages, just hand stick men, really terrible. And Amma was brilliant because he published them in Agile Journal. And then Agile 2009, we collected those 4 or 5 stories into a comic book, and we ran an experiment at Agile 2009. And the experiment was really simple. Everyone thought the comic book was an experiment, and it wasn't. The real experiment, where there were 5 adverts in the comic book, and we wanted to see if we could create sticky content so that people would continue to keep the comic book for a long time, and as a result, the adverts would be long lasting, because normally you get the stuff in the conference bag and it gets thrown away straight away. Well, that experiment worked. And having seen this, Olav, who I was we were presenting about real options and writing articles about real options, looked at the format and went, you know what, we should do this as a comic book. And I think it's mainly to do with the fact that real options is a combination of financial mathematics and applied psychology, 2 of the most boring subjects on earth. And we thought, how can we make it interesting and easy to read? And that's how it happened. Olav just said, yeah, let's do this as a graphic novel. And then we went off and applied real options to the way that we do it.
And it works because it is genuinely easy to read. I don't think I've read any book as quickly, and also got a lot out of it. So it's fantastic. I think
So here's a little nugget then for you, kind of like one of those things that a lot of people don't know. So when you do real options, what we're looking for is commitments. And so Chris Geary, the artist, Olav and I met for 1 day, and we spent most of the day discussing one subject, because we knew if we made a mistake with that one subject, it would cause a very expensive rework of the whole book. See if you can guess what that subject was. What subject did we spend most of the only day we spent together to design the book? And you won't get it.
I honestly can't think. No. So go on, put me out of my misery.
It was the hair of the main character.
Right. It's a topic very close to my heart.
Yeah, but it was like her hair was the main topic. So we had this really spent hours discussing, when she was stressed, she'd have her hair up in it tightly in a bunch. And when she gets more relaxed, her hair comes down. And then there's one bit where she's really enjoying herself, and then there's a bad scene, and very cautiously she just puts her hair up again. So because most of the other things, like for example, Luke Homan was brilliant. He found a massive plot flaw in the whole book. And we were like, oh my God. So Olav and I spent 2 hours working out what to do to fix it. And it turned out we changed one line in one speech bubble, and that was fine. But if we got the hair wrong, we were making a major commitment, and we had to redraw loads and loads of pages. So we spent most of our time discussing her hair.
That's great. But I suppose you're absolutely right that textual changes, I'm guessing, were fairly straightforward to make late on.
Yeah.
That anything around the way something is drawn, that's not too bad if it's on one page. But if it's a theme running through the whole book, then, like you say, you're almost starting from scratch again, aren't you? So I guess we're a little bit in danger of teasing people too much now, because we've talked about the book and we've mentioned real options, but not really described what real options are or what they are useful for. And I know it's not an easy concept to convey quickly, but do you think you could try to kind of give an idea of what real options are and then how they can be used?
Okay, so for anyone who doesn't like really technical stuff, fingers in the ear for the next 10 seconds. Right, so real options is basically, I looked at financial options and I worked out what of the aspects of financial options can we take to help us manage risk and to make decisions. So it was based on the fact that Kevin Tate at Agile 2003, Agile Development Conference in 2003, put up a graph that shows the risk profile of a waterfall project and the risk profile of a Agile project, and the difference between the two was real options. So it's a very technical thing. So that's the technical bit. You can now take your fingers out your ears. Real options is really simple. There are 4 rules. The first one is options have value. Now, what we can't say, though, is what that value is. We just know that they have value, and it's very subjective, and in the real world, it changes very rapidly. The second is options expire. So if you're not careful, if you just leave things, a lot of those options will actually disappear, and you will have missed a chance to do something. And this is what avoids procrastination. It makes it an active management system rather than a kind of passive one. And then the third one is never commit early unless you know why. The first and the third are about changing your behavior and to keep options open rather than close them down. And as Dan would put it, to make decisions deliberately. The second one tells you when you have to make a decision. Now, the fourth one is, and we don't talk about it too much, but options increase in value with uncertainty. So if you know with absolute certainty something that's going to happen, well, there are no options actually don't give you much value. However, if you're completely uncertain about what's going to happen, options have much more value. So it's these 4 simple things. And then what happens is you apply them all over the place and you come out with some quite bizarre behaviors. So, for example, when we were discussing earlier, the natural conclusion of never commit early unless you know why is that you should always start with the output of a system. Yeah. So you start with the output, you work out what the value is to the customer. So then once you've got the output, you can then work out what processing you need, and then you work out the inputs. And this is a rational decision process to work in that way. Whereas if you start with the inputs, what often happens is when you get to the outputs and you show whatever you've done to your customers, they change their mind as to what they want. And as a result, you have to change the inputs. Whereas if you can get them to lock down on the output first, then at least that's solid, and the rest. Not only that, as you work backwards, you get to a certain point and you have many options in the ways that you can actually satisfy that particular thing. So the example we talk about in the book is we want a cup of tea. Well, when you go forward, what you normally go is, right, I want a tea bag, so therefore that I can make a cup of tea. When you go backwards, you go, right, okay, I want a cup of tea. But now you say, what are the many different ways I have of actually supplying tea, the tea part of it? So I could have a tea bag, I could have an expensive tea bag, I could have a ridiculously expensive tea bag, I could have loose leaf tea in a teapot, I could have loose leaf tea in one of those strange little metal things that goes like that, and all sorts of. But there are all different ways, and according to your context, one is better than the other.
Yeah.
But it allows you to better cope with context rather than forcing a solution on all different types of things. Whereas I say, when you go forwards, you always go, right, you satisfy and go, tea bag, that'll do. That's best in all contexts. And it's not.
And it's one of those, there's a talk I give around some agile subjects, and in it, I show people a lottery ticket. So a lottery ticket for a draw this evening, or, a couple of days in the future. And I ask them to estimate the value of it. And most people say, well, £1, because, I bought it that morning for £1. And then I say, right, now we're going to see what the real value is by trying to auction it off to the people in the room. Rarely does it ever sell for £1. Surprisingly, sometimes it sells for more than £1, which baffles me. But I think if you get 2 people vying in an auction, then real value kind of goes out of the window. But after that, I always say to people, the reason I go through that is that you usually, in that circumstance, you wouldn't commit any earlier than you had to. And if you could wait to buy that ticket until after you knew the result of the draw, you would wait, wouldn't you? You'd wait until you knew what it's worth. And then I tell people, and also if you if I offered it to you, you might even be prepared to pay me 50 pence or 10 pence to have the option of buying it for £5 after the draw. And this seems quite, explained like that, people understand that it's not always good to make a decision up front. But what I've noticed is a lot of people will do this intuitively, but having it kind of formalized and described the way you have helps you to do it really quickly and with a lot less pain. And the example I have just from a few months ago, last summer, we were trying to organise a family camping trip, but we didn't know exactly who would be able to make it. We didn't even know whether we'd be able to go. The campsite was filling up, and all I had to do was think, well, actually, when I book the campsite, all I'm doing is paying for an option to go camping on that date. I don't have to use that option, and rarely are you paying the full price. So I think their cancellation was one night's worth of camping, so or the deposit paid. So actually the price of that option was less than the full price. And given that, I could quite happily say, well, is it worth £36 for me to have the option to go camping? Then yes, it is. We'll book. And then you don't feel so stressed about, well, now we have to make sure we go, or should we, or can we wait, or will it fill up? And of course, in practice, a lot of the time things do go as planned, or roughly as planned, and it all works out very well. So I found decisions that I might have made before the same way, I was able to make almost in an instant, almost without fretting too much about it. Is it worth that to me for the option to go? So I think it's really helpful in that respect across a number of different areas.
And I think that's the way that a lot of people have found value in real options. It's not like they've necessarily changed their behavior, but it's given them a language and a way of explaining the way they think and process decisions that have helped others. I mean, I love your story there. That's classic. I mean, because I can always tell when someone gets real options because they apply it in their own personal life. And a friend of mine did the same thing. And it was, and the message I got from him was, once again, it helped him having the language. So his son was coming to the age where he needed to go to high school. There were 3 schools. There was the good state school that was free. That was their first choice. The second choice was a private school, but they didn't want to pay for it really. So it's second, but the worst choice was the bad state school. And obviously they wanted the first choice. And he explained it to his wife that they were going to pay the deposit for the private school just in case he didn't. And it was an insurance premium. There was an option to go there. And they paid the insurance premium. And as it turned out, his son didn't get in to the good state school. And so what had been a second choice all of a sudden became their first choice. And because they'd paid it, there was no stress. And they didn't need to worry. We're going through a very similar strategy at the moment, my partner and I, where we have a preference for one, but we're actually paying for the second just because if we don't, and we don't get the first one, the second one won't be an option, and then that'll be major stress, which is option 3, kind of all hell breaks loose.
And I think as well, where the thinking helps in that scenario that you describe is when you think of it as an insurance premium, then had he got his first choice, you would just go, hooray, we've got our first choice. And okay, we paid that, but it was our insurance. You don't worry. Whereas I think if you don't have that mindset, then you feel like you've wasted. Oh, if only we hadn't put that deposit down, because that's all wasted now. It wasn't wasted because what you bought was an option. And I think that's really helpful. And I think, as you say, it's in some of those scenarios, it's really easy to see. I think when I spoke with Liz Keogh, she said things like rollback, and I think that comes up in the book as well. Writing rollback scripts, you invest in something that you hope you won't have to use. But the reason you do it is to give you an option, to give you an ability to do something in the future. If you wait till the server's down, it's too late to think about writing a rollback script.
And the crazy thing is, not only do you write the rollback script, you test it.
Yes.
And you test it in production. So you perhaps do a release where you do a rollback before you intend to, just to have that confidence that when something does go wrong, it's easy to roll back.
Yeah.
And that that, and it'll give you more confidence moving forward. One thing I'll pick up on, which is I think a key word there, is stress. Which is, once you start thinking about this, a lot of people who do it actually find life a lot less stressful because they're less worried about the outcome of events that are outside of their control. And they can relax because they know, well, actually, I have a very clear understanding of what the outcome of the event is. And okay, it's not perfect, but it's not terrible. And then your big problem becomes, if you do it too much, that you get stressed because you're bored.
I feel a long way away from that. But I think another small point that, well, not a small point, something you just mentioned briefly was that the power of this is when there is uncertainty. So,
Yes.
you know, if I know that my whole family is available on that date to go camping and there's oodles of space at the campsite, then real options doesn't really help me. It's when there's uncertainty that it gives me a way of thinking through something. I suppose,
Yeah.
again, and this has been a recurring theme, I think there can be a tendency to overestimate how certain we are about software development. And maybe perhaps you could expand a little bit on that, and particularly when we think about
it's a commonly known heuristic that people are really, really bad at actually predicting the probability of something bad from happening.
Right.
And I was in a classic meeting many years ago, and I was actually organising a operational project. It wasn't a software project. It was an operational task that involved 300 process steps that needed to happen over a 2-day period. And about 3 weeks before we actually ran this process in one of the banks, another project started off to do another little operational project. But it's a bit like the trains. Everything needed to be in the right place at the start of the day. And if things weren't in the right place at the start of the day, we'd be messed up. So I called a meeting to say, right, okay, what I want you to consider is that your little project over here that you've just kind of announced, what happens if you fail and the trains are all in the wrong place? What are we going to do to make sure that the trains are in the right place? And we spent 45 minutes. So there's 12 people in a room. We spent 45 minutes arguing about whether we should have the meeting. And there was a point at which the project manager for this project said, there's no chance that this can fail. There is a 99.99% chance of this succeeding, at which point I knew it would fail, because the guy was a moron. Because there is no way you could get to that level of certainty if human beings are involved in the process, and it was an entirely human process. We then got past the point in the meeting of saying, right, should we have this meeting or not? They agreed, okay, we're going to have the meeting anyway. And in 5 minutes, we'd put together a mitigation, which was an extra 5 minutes of work that needed to be done operationally to create something. So if there was a problem, we were okay. Guess what? It failed completely. Their project completely failed. We didn't even send out an email to everyone to tell them what to do, because we'd already done it, and everyone knew actually that project's failed, but we don't care because we know what the mitigation plan is. And it comes to that thing of the plan is useless, but the planning is valuable. And it's that kind of thing.
And I suppose that's where it perhaps ties in with Cynefin a little bit as well. And it's a very common question I get is, when should we use Agile and when should we use Waterfall? Cynefin can help with that, but I always stress that there can be a temptation to think you're in a more certain, predictable environment than you really are. And I would argue that most software is in that complex domain.
So what I would suggest is that with Cynefin, there's actually a nuance. So the answer is you always do Agile for your delivery. The question is, how do you fill the backlog? Do you fill the backlog in one go as a single shot, or do you fill it iteratively, where you launch something in production, get feedback, and then you kind of build the next iteration of the backlog? So in the truly complex space, so if you're trying to improve the conversion rate on a part of your product, you're in the complex space, you build a little bit, you put it live, you get some feedback, based on the feedback you change and you add something new to the backlog. So it's an iterative build of the backlog, but you always build small bits anyway. Alternatively, there are some projects, so I worked on one where we were basically building with the product we had to create the new version of the product for the new version of the operating system that it would sit on top of. So there was a version 1 of the operating system. We were going to version 2 of the operating system. There were changes that were needed to be done. So we could actually go through and analyze and identify all those changes we needed to do, even to the level of we could identify which areas of the code base do we want to refactor. We then do the refactoring as a complex task, but we got all these items in the backlog, and then we could actually make all the changes. But once again, you want to do it in such a way that you can deliver in small chunks, because then that gives you management of the delivery risk whereas kind of in the complex space, it's more management of the business risk, or in actual fact, it's not just business risk. It's often things like performance management. So, what we call non-functional requirements, which basically means we cannot determine in advance what the results requirements are. They're often in the complex space as well.
I've got to say, sorry, just briefly, one of my colleagues said we should probably just refer to them as forgotten requirements, or things we missed requirements, because the line is quite blurred. But yes, carry on. Sorry.
But what that indicates normally is that you are building a product based on the features, not based on your product, which is your customers and their needs.
Right.
So, for example, if your customers have a need to get a page response of 2 seconds, well, that's not a non-functional requirement. That's a requirement for your customers, and it's how we think of. It comes to the point we were saying earlier: is non-functional requirements come out of a belief that the product owner owns the product that you're creating, rather than the product owner owns responsibility for satisfying the needs of the customers who will use the product. And when you shift like that, all of a sudden non-functionals just disappear.
Yes, it all becomes part of as you say, it all becomes, again, right. One of the very earliest chats we had was with Mike Burrows about Kanban, and he said, one of the things he started to do, although he didn't call it that at the time, was have a final validation step, which was are the end user needs being met. So it's not have they signed it off, not have we released into production, but is the actual need that we intended to meet being addressed. So I just want to bring you back to something you said right at the start, which was you spoke about Agile and you spoke about waterfall, and you were saying that actually Agile is a way of reducing risk on a software delivery. And I think it's still quite common for people to see Agile as more risky. So I'd be interested in you just expanding on that a little bit.
So what we have is there's culturally, if you use Dave Snowden's world, in effect, culturally, in the obvious and the complicated space, we have things where we know with certainty. Either in obvious, everyone knows; in complicated, there are experts that know. Most traditional organizations operate in that space. That's where they make money. It's not a bad thing. When you go across into the complex and chaos domain, you have uncertainty. And what happens is people in the complicated obvious are risk averse generally. They do not like uncertainty. They're risk averse. Whereas people in the complex, who are used to operating in the complex and the chaos domains, investment banks, startups, and all those kind of things, oil exploration, actually manage risk. And the risk aversion means that people don't even like talking about risk. And so the problem with things like Agile is that we have the methodologies called extreme programming. And the thing about extreme programming is if you're risk averse, this sounds scary. This is extreme programming. It's like extreme sports. And I remember, oh my God, it's 15 years ago. I was working with the head of credit risk at a major oil company, responsible for a huge portfolio of risk and credit risk. And I explained about, this thing, extreme programming. It's actually less risky than other products, but however, because people hear extreme programming, they think of extreme sports and extreme ironing and all these other dangerous things. And his answer just stopped me in the tracks. He just turned around and he goes, you know what? If those guys in extreme sports don't understand risk, they're dead. So obviously it's going to be better managed.
Yeah, and I was going to say it because I used to do quite a bit of climbing, and I think there are stats around the fact that actually climbing is relatively safe compared to driving, for example, because you're acutely aware of the risks, and so and
you're focused,
yes,
and you manage those risks.
Exactly. That's kind of the whole point of the game. So yeah, it's a very good point that if you're aware, and I think we've certainly within Worldline we've found that sometimes what Agile can do is it can expose risks and issues early. And the problem can be when people say, well, that's happened because we're doing it in an Agile way. Whereas often the reality is it would have happened anyway, but you might have only found out about it 12 months down the line with a more traditional approach.
When many of the options that you would actually have to mitigate the risk have expired.
Have expired, yeah. So that ties it all back very nicely.
But it's important to understand that the real value, the real risk management comes when you do production releases or into an environment like production. If you do water scrumful, so a lot of consultancies are, it's very popular for the consultancy. Yes, we're going to do Scrum, and they just use Scrum for the delivery piece, but then they create a massive backlog of features to be built. So, which would be fine if you're in the complicated domain, but quite often you're in the complex domain. You lose all your risk management then. So your risk profile of a water scrumful project from a business risk perspective is exactly the same as for a waterfall project.
And I think that's the thing. You have to have, in my view, software released into production, and ideally some validation from the customer or the user that it is their need, and you have to do that on a regular basis. Without that, you're still storing up a lot of not as much, but a lot of the risk.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I really hate is the word project, because there are no projects. There are only investments in IT. The business make investments in IT. And if you think about that, you realize there are three categories of risk associated with an IT investment. The first one, which is the one that Waterfall pays lip service to, but it's pretty bad at managing, is delivery risk. So on time, to budget, to scope. Yeah. It's actually one of the least significant risks compared to business case risk. Are we building something that our customers will actually want? Are we going to satisfy the need, as you mentioned? That we don't mitigate at all with Waterfall, but we can with Agile. And then finally, with short iteration, and then finally, risk to the existing business model. So this is where you put something live and you damage your existing business model. Well, by doing Agile and doing small incremental steps, it makes it easy to roll things back if you have made a mistake. And that could be a technical mistake, or it could be a business mistake where you introduce the feature in your product that actually destroys the revenue stream for another part of your business. And you decide, actually, we're going to withdraw that. But if it becomes part of a massive product that you're releasing all in one go after 2 years, well, you've just trashed one of your existing revenue streams without knowing it.
Yeah. So it's been so fascinating. I'm very conscious of time because I always go over, and today is not going to be an exception. But what I'd love is if we could just finish off with perhaps one tip, sort of top tip from yourself for how to get started with real options thinking, other than purchasing your book and reading it cover to cover. That's a given. So
the top tip then. So I was going to use work backwards as a top tip, but I've used that one already. So the other one I would do, something that Olav and I talk about when we do conferences, is understand the difference between what is an option and what is a commitment. Yeah. So an airline ticket, is that an option or a commitment? Do you have to get on the plane, or is it an option to get on the plane?
Yeah.
And then the other is, when is it not even an option? So as soon as those plane doors are closed, you no longer have an option to get on that plane, even if you have a ticket. So understand some things are options, some things are commitment, and then some things just aren't possible at all. And just by thinking about things in those terms, what you discover is that a lot of the things that you thought as commitments are actually options, and a lot of the things that you think of as options aren't actually options at all.
Don't actually exist. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you ever so much.
My pleasure.
I'm really looking forward to the Twitter chat as well on Thursday night with yourself. That's been really interesting. As always, I've learned a lot myself, so I really appreciate your time and look forward to
my pleasure
on Thursday.
Thank you.